Wendy Carlos has done a lot of different important stuff in her life. Some composers have one really good idea and make a career out of it, but Carlos has made several contributions to the world of music. She started her career at the first electronic music studio in North America, then called the Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Center. A few years later, she met Bob Moog and helped him to design some of the first commercially successful synthesizers. She became the first person to bring electronic music into popular consciousness with her platinum-selling record Switched on Bach. Then she released an ambient new age record called Sonic Seasonings 3 years before Brian Eno's Discrete Music, which is the album largely credited for having invented ambient music. Carlos also performed and composed original music for some influential films including A Clockwork Orange, The Shining, and Disney's Tron. After a few follow-up releases to Switch on Bach, she became totally focused on digital synthesis. She wanted to create sounds that had the same subtle, complex variations that orchestral instruments produced, so she synthesized an entire library of nearly 500 digital replicas of orchestral instruments. Carlos is also the first publicly open trans woman in electronic music. So let's take a look at Wendy Carlos, how she changed the world with Switched on Bach, her ambient music, her work with film, her digital compositions, and the unique skills she used in them, and we're going to look at what her career means for us now and moving forward in the world of electronic music. Wendy Carlos met Bob Moog literally by waking him up. When she was a master's student at Columbia, her director, Vladimir Usichevsky, who also played a big role in the development of electronic music, suggested that she visit an Audio Engineering Society convention taking place at Midtown. She was immediately impressed by a booth called Moog Synthesizer Modules, behind which Bob Moog was taking a nap. The Audio Engineering Society has since gained in popularity. This was the beginning of a long friendship and professional relationship that did more to popularize electronic music probably than any other. Carlos became one of the first Moog customers, and her synth was personally delivered to her home studio. Moog was an engineer and not a musician, and recognized that he would need feedback from somebody who was actually going to be using his instruments. So they formed a close working relationship. Carlos would take home a new module, experiment with it, and return with new ideas or refinements. Back then, all the Moog synths were modular, which means that instead of being made in a single contained unit, each sound-making or processing component, or module, was sold separately. This turned out to be a pretty good business model. Anyway, so Carlos played a big role in the development of Moog synthesizers. One of the biggest design decisions that would secure Moog's place in synth history was, although it may seem comically obvious now, to use a keyboard that would work with a synth. The early Moog keyboards were not pressure sensitive, meaning that you could tap a key as lightly as possible or hit it as hard as you could, and the synth would produce a sound of the same volume. Carlos wanted to play her synth dynamically and encouraged Moog to add the feature. It ended up being the only pressure-sensitive keyboard that was available for the next decade. This is probably hard to imagine from our current perspective, but back then, electronic music was, to quote Carlos, considered by the general public to be completely without redeeming value or commercial interest. Back then, almost all electronic music was made in institutions, meaning that it was made with a dogmatically formal and highly dissonant modernist style. Carlos felt that people misplaced their feelings about the modernist music style with the technology of electronic music that was pretty much aesthetically neutral. She thought that she could win people over by creating something that was more familiar. She thought she could do this by, quote, noodling together some inventions by Papa Bach. She didn't have great ambitions for the few recordings she made, and went on making her own compositions with her new instrument. This was until she met a record producer named Rachel Elkind, who would become an essential collaborator throughout Carlos's career. Carlos was impressed by Elkind, who was well-connected and musically educated.
Secretly, I hoped she would become my producer, but no. Even though she thought some of my examples were interesting, she would have none of it. Except one thing, a realization of Bach's invention of F major, done only a few months earlier.
Elkind convinced Carlos that she could gain respect for her own music after she showed her performance skills on some familiar works. So they worked together closely to realize some of Bach's most loved compositions with Carlos's Moog synthesizer. Towards the end of production, Elkind was able to sell the record to CBS, who picked it up thinking it was low risk, considering that the record was nearly already finished. Switched on Bach went on to sell over 1 million copies and became the first platinum-selling classical record of all time. It won 3 Grammys, including Best Classical Record, but its influence was far greater than just any top-selling album. It would have been the first time that the vast majority of people would have been exposed to any electronic music at all. Many of the most influential artists of the era were inspired to experiment with synthesizers after hearing the record. We're talking the Beatles, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Stevie Wonder, Tangerine Dream. The Moog synth was rapidly made famous and is still one of the most iconic symbols of electronic music. And obviously, the huge success was very exciting for everyone who was involved. But Carlos, who never set out to be a keyboardist and had great ambitions as a composer, was left with mixed feelings about all of it.
To be candid, it was irritating to me. It felt like a detour, and it still does when I think back at it. It represented so little of my strengths, and so much of what I could only sort of do. And I'm still a bit embarrassed by that, being considered a classical performer first. There are so many people who write me and tell me how they got involved with classical music through SOB, which drives me slightly nuts.
She still refers to the album affectionately as SOB. She's recorded 4 more switched-on records over the course of her career, but as you already know, this was only one of her many accomplishments. In 1972, Wendy Carlos released Sonic Seasonings, a 4-track album with each track representing a different season of the year. It's made of mostly slow, meandering melodies and nature-fueled recordings. It develops extremely slowly with only ever a few elements playing at once. These days it would be easily categorized as new age or ambient, but back then when Carlos had the idea, those terms didn't exist. Although Sonic Seasonings came out 3 years before Discrete Music, which pretty much got all the credit, clearly the two composers were responding to similar forces. In the academic high art world, composers were intensely focused on responding to the events of the Second World War by rejecting tonal harmony, consonants of any kind, melodies, repetitive rhythmic structures, basically all the parts of music that people like. And some of the most detailed music that I can think of came out of this era. And just as an aside, I really do love a lot of modernist music. But the composers who thought their vision for the future of music would become the new tradition were pretty naive. Anyway, ambient music was a way for Carlos to respond to this densely structured new music.
For us, the idea was to find a music that didn't require lengthy, concentrated listening. We thought that if you enlarged each gesture and slowed the pace, you could stand back and still have the same perspective. It wouldn't hold to the scrutiny of looking close up and wasn't intended to. It was a mode not well explored back then and seemed healthy because so much 20th century music had been focusing even tighter, high-powered microscopes peering at short, fiercely intricate pieces. I wanted to get some air and stand back a bit, see where that might lead.
Ambient music has had incredible staying power, and is just as popular now as it ever was. Although the 1970s were much slower and less connected than things are now, I think Carlos and the composers who followed her were able to respond to a broadly felt need to find ways of slowing down through music. In the mid-1970s, Carlos worked with Stanley Kubrick on A Clockwork Orange and The Shining. Although Carlos says that she got along well with Kubrick at first, the actual production process was arduous and frustrating. After the contributions she made to A Clockwork Orange, most notably her epic synth adaptation of Henry Purcell's Funeral March used in the title music, she was asked back to work on The Shining. Communication was difficult, and Kubrick ended up getting so attached to the temp tracks that he used while editing that he ended up keeping very little of the many hours of the music that Carlos and Elkin produced for him. Even more discouraging for Carlos, Warner Brothers owned the rights to all the music they produced. So she ended up working for only a few dollars an hour to produce tons of music that she was really proud of, but she didn't even own. At least she did gain in reputation from the experience, and was asked to compose all of the music for Disney's Tron in 1982. And as far as I can tell, that process went much more smoothly. At around this time, computer technology was starting to improve, and digital synthesis was becoming more accessible. Carlos was feeling frustrated with the limitations of analog synthesis, specifically its ability to recreate the micro variations that acoustic instruments naturally produced.
Somehow the sounds of the older acoustic instruments were still much better. I began to understand that it was the utter simplicity of the synthesizer sounds that was their downfall. Acoustic instruments evolved over the ages to satisfy the human desire for subtly complex sounds. The synthesizer, as it evolved only over a few decades, produced sounds that were neither subtle nor complex and became boring with repetition once the novelty wore off.
She made 2 albums in the 1980s that exclusively used digital synthesis. In order to lay the groundwork for her digital music, she created an entire orchestra of synthesized sounds using over 500 separate patches. If you ever want to work on your ear training, this would whip you into shape pretty quickly. She called this library the LSI, or Large Scale Integration Philharmonic. The first album she made with the LSI is called Digital Moonscapes. Another appeal of digital synthesis is its ability to precisely render specific pitches and stay in tune. So on her second digital album, Carlos used a bunch of different scales and invented 4 non-octave repeating just-in-tone scales. If you want a more complete background on tuning, check out my video on just intonation. But here's a quick summary. Basically, the current system that we use is called equal temperament. It's based off of the acoustic behavior of consonant instruments, like the pattern of a vibrating string called the harmonic series. The problem with the harmonic series is that it produces intervals that aren't evenly spaced apart, which causes all kinds of technical issues when composing music using Western tonal music theory. So at some point, we basically all agreed to flatten and sharpen all the intervals so that they could be equally spaced apart, and we could kind of forget about the problem of tuning. But in order to do this, we had to make a lot of the intervals quite out of tune with the model that they're based off of. Carlos realized that she could make evenly spaced scales that were more in tune with thirds and fifths if she didn't bother including an octave. She used a computer to calculate these 4 scales that she called alpha, beta, gamma, and delta. She used these in my favorite piece of hers, the title track for the album Beauty and the Beast. It's exciting, uplifting, and kind of serene and melancholy. If there's any piece of hers you listen to after watching this video, it should definitely be this one. The Beauty and the Beast record uses all kinds of interesting scales and experimental ideas. If you're interested in hearing some more familiar music made with the LSI, and many of the other instruments that Carlos has used throughout her career, check out Secrets of Synthesis, released in 1987. The role that Wendy Carlos's identity has played throughout her career has been complicated. She's been misrepresented by the media so much that she's now reluctant to make public appearances of any kind. She came out publicly in an interview with Arthur Bell in 1979 for Playboy magazine. She insisted that she would only do the interview if the majority of it focused on her music, and the Playboy editors assured her that it would, but lied to her, and instead focused almost entirely on her gender. This was the first of many publications that would make a spectacle of her identity and more or less ignore her importance as a composer. This has understandably led Carlos to try and maintain a lot of control over her narrative. And her website contains so much amazing information about her life, her ideas, and her creative philosophies. There's a ton of great stuff in there that I had to leave out, like the instruments she built, her photography, and a bunch of interviews. It's definitely the place to go if you want to learn more about her. And it has this amazing, early internet GeoCities vibe, and if you look closely enough, the background actually spells out her name. Carlos says that her experiences as a trans woman have nothing to do with her music. And as much as I don't believe that's possible, it's pretty understandable that she wants to be seen as just a musician, considering everything that she's been through. Even now, 40 years after she came out, society has a hard time seeing trans people as just people. But a lot has changed since the 70s and 80s. Now some of the most famous and influential electronic musicians in the world are trans women, like Sophie, Arca, and Kim Petras. And there are so many amazing trans women electronic musicians across the entire field, including the 4 women who read the quotes for this video. Just before the pandemic, the Untuck Collective hosted a Wendy Carlos tribute night, where queer and trans artists, including Octo Ota, played synth music inspired by her. As a trans woman myself, I have to say that Carlos's influence has been a lot greater than that of just a musician. Making this video has brought up a lot of complicated feelings for me, but one of the most persistent feelings has just been we can do this. And we are doing this right now. Electronic music has been so much more than just an interest for me. It's been a lifeline. And I know I'm not the only one that feels that way. Her example makes me feel like we can take this thing and build a community around it, work together and support each other with it. We can even act as an example for other people and say it might not be easy or sometimes even safe to be openly trans, but it's possible. Her example has shown millions of people that we're here, even if that wasn't her intention. I hope that Wendy Carlos is remembered mostly for her contributions to music, because they've been seismic. But I hope that she can also be remembered for her role in making the world a safer place for trans women to be all that we are, because we couldn't have gotten here without her. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching this episode of Sounds Good. It was definitely a tough one to make, but it was also probably the most rewarding, so I hope you liked it. If you really liked it, the best way you can support my channel is through my Patreon, and the link is down below right there. But if you can't sign up to my Patreon right now, probably the best way would be to just share it with somebody who you think would like it. I hope that person who was just walking past me didn't just interrupt what I said. Anyways, see you guys in a couple weeks.